On the early afternoon of December 4th, 1872, in the open ocean off the coast of Portugal, Captain Morehouse is summoned to the deck of his ship, the Canadian brigantine De Grazia. His helmsman reports to him that a vessel has been spotted dead ahead and is heading directly toward them. Morehouse grabs his telescope and he takes a look, and he sees a ship, sails up, and everything seems normal. But when he squints a little harder, a cold shiver works its way up his spine, because what he is seeing is impossible. He sends 3 of his best men over to the ship on a rowboat, and what the men find when they board, or rather, don't find, is so unheard of and so hard to explain that it became a mystery that has continued to this day, 150 years later. This is the story of the Mary Celeste Ghost Ship. Let's get weird. Morehouse watches his men climb up into the deck of the merchant ship Mary Celeste. And he's a little nervous because this is becoming quite a delay. You see, he himself captains a merchant ship, and he's hauling petroleum to Gibraltar. But he's also getting a little excited because if what his eyes are telling him is true, what he just discovered could make him a lot of money. As you might have already guessed, there's no one on this ship. And as normal-ish as it might be for ships to just straight up disappear in the wild, unforgiving ocean, for folks to disappear and a ship to keep on sailing by itself ain't. This has got to be the weirdest thing for these guys to see. It's like landing on the moon, except there's already a guy there like, hi, but the opposite. I mean, look at it. This is a painting of it when it was called the Amazon, which we'll get to later. But I mean, it takes a lot of people to sail a ship like that, which means a lot of people have disappeared. Once they recover from the shock of such an eerie absence of people, Morehouse's men start to search the deck, and they find it to be organized, and by all accounts, completely normal. There is absolutely no sign of struggle, violence, emergency, or even urgency of, say, an evacuation. The first interesting thing they discover is that the sails are only partially set up. The jib and foretop staysail is set, the lower foretop sail is hanging by the 4 corners, and the upper foretop sail and foresail are gone. Perhaps blown away from weather, who knows. The main staysail was hauled down and lying on the forward house loose. So that means that some were rigged up properly, but others were taken down and lying on the deck with their rigging ropes hanging over the sides. Not neatly rolled up as would be customary at the time, but also not torn or broken in any way. Next, they discover that the main hatch cover is securely closed, but 2 other hatches, the fore, front of the boat, and the lazarette, near the steering wheel, were open, their covers lying neatly beside them on the deck. These hatches were typically used for storing equipment, but both also connected to the larger cargo hold below. Also, the ship's single lifeboat was missing. Okay, so maybe they all willingly bailed. But why would you bail out of a perfectly seaworthy ship? By all accounts, it's in perfect condition. The only damage, which is minimal, was to some of the planks, a piece of railing, and the binnacle, which is a waist-high stand generally mounted in front of the helmsman that was housing the ship's compass. It had shifted from its place, and its glass cover was broken. Likely from strong weather, as it does live on the deck, exposed. Lying on the deck near the cargo hatch was a homemade sounding rod for measuring the amount of water that accumulates in the hold. A fairly normal method of the time for calculating water depth. Fun little side quest here, sounding rods have nothing to do with sound. They're links of rope with markers tied every fathom, which is 6 feet or, 2 meters, so they can easily be interpreted by feeling during day or night checking water depth. And if the depth was at exactly the point of, say, one of the marks, the leadsman would yell, "By the mark!" But if it was at exactly 2 marks, he'd call, "By the mark twain!" which is another word for 2 in the 1800s. So as you may have figured out, it was a common enough phrase on ships in the 1800s that a young writer named Samuel Clemens heard it and ended up making it famous as his pseudonym. Next, the men look inside the cargo hold. The hatches to it are already lying open, and they see about 3 feet of water, or 1 meter, accumulated in the bottom. A significant but not alarming amount for a ship of this size. It's even normal enough that ships often have pumps on hand to keep stuff like this under control, which were found and functioning properly. and as the men continue to search the ship, they come to the first mate's quarters. He's in charge of the ship's official logbook, which they find inside, and its final entry is dated 8 a.m. November 25th, so 9 days prior. And his last logged position was recorded as just off Santa Maria Island in the Azores, nearly 400 miles away from its current position. He also logged some strange experiences, instances of hearing grumbling, moaning, and even growling from inside the cargo hold. I quote, "mysterious rumblings from the galley of the ship, growls and rumbles," end quote. He recorded this in the ship's log. In the captain's quarters, they find a sword under his bed, sheathed and apparently unneeded by its owner in his final hours. They also discover the beds of the captain and his child, we'll get back to that, were unmade. The shape of the little child's body still eerily visible in the mattress. All of the captain's and crew's belongings were left behind. The ship had plenty of food and water for the rest of the voyage. It was notable that the windows and shutters all showed signs of being boarded up to protect from bad weather, but the cabin interiors were all soaking wet due to the cabin skylight being deliberately left propped open, letting rainwater in. Why would you have every window boarded up, then pop open the one big skylight in the ceiling? By the time they complete their search of this ship, you can imagine that Captain Morehouse and his crew were quite affected. Like they must have been overwhelmed with concern for the poor souls who inhabited this boat and what could have possibly happened to them. Nah, I'm just kidding. They're super stoked. They can sell it, salvage it, and make a crap load of money. So they split up into two small crews and sailed both the Mary Celeste and the DeGratia to the next port, where the authorities would have a good, hard look at the Mary Celeste and her history. Before the Mary Celeste was ending lives, hers began in Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, built by the mind and hands of Joshua Dewis, a shipbuilder who built a shipyard right next to a forest full of timber owned by his brother-in-law. As partners, they began to build their very special and very first ship, unaware she would become so infamous. Built literally by hand with axes and handsaws until she was finally completed and christened the Amazon in 1861. This is an actual painting of the ship, the first that is known. She was 25 feet wide and 99 feet long. Here's a fun fact. She killed her first captain. No joke. You thought I was out of line with those sixes, but nope, she earned it. Robert McClelland, a young newlywed, was hired to sail her to London for her first voyage. Captain got sick before the ship even cleared the bay. They turned her around, back to Spencer's Island, and he died soon after right there in the ship's owner's house. But after poor young Mr. McClelland, she managed to sail uneventfully for 7 years, until she was transferred to American ownership in 1868, where she was renamed Mary Celeste. She sailed reliably for 4 more years until her fateful final voyage in 1872. Our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a fine voyage. You gotta love how they talked back then. Those are the words of Captain Benjamin Briggs as he sets out on his first and only voyage on the Mary Celeste. Briggs was a family man, and he didn't want to be away for months at a time without his family, so on this particular voyage, he decided to take his wife, Sarah, and 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, with him. They also had a son, Arthur, but he was in school, and they thought, well, let's not interrupt his schooling. He'll stay with Grandma and Grandpa. You'll go on the next one, buddy. Dang, though. Imagine you're a little kid. You probably think Mom and Dad abandoned you to be tortured at school for no reason you can understand, only for it to be your lucky break and become the only surviving member of your family. I'm sure he turned out fine. See, he lived till 66. Died on Halloween. The first mate was Albert Richardson. He's the one whose logbook we found. And the second mate was named Andrew Gilling. And there was a cook named Edmund Head and 4 Prussian sailors for a total of 10 crew members. 10 people. According to records, Briggs had respect for these sailors, even though he didn't find them particularly, intelligent. Dang, Briggs, just keeping it real, huh? The ship's final crew member was 2-year-old Sophia's cat. The plan for this voyage was to haul 1,701 barrels of alcohol to Italy. You know, one of the impressions was like, what big deal if one barrel goes missing? Apologies to all Prussians for that accent. I don't know what that was. The barrels were laid on their side with pieces of wood wedged between them to prevent them from rolling around. Alright, let's cut to the freaking chase here, y'all, because I love a good ghost story like everybody else, but it is necessary to acknowledge the relevance of the fact that in this era, alcohol was widely considered one of the most dangerous things to transport, because if it wasn't properly vented, dangerous fumes could accumulate or even explode. Which kind of makes that whole move of Briggs bringing his wife and kid with him a bit less, and a bit more, bro, what are you thinking? Irregardless, the 10 of them load up with those 1,701 barrels of booze, and the Mary Celeste set sail into the Atlantic on Tuesday, November 5th, leaving Staten Island after some weather delays. Interestingly, there was a ship in the same port nearby about to begin her voyage across the Atlantic, the DeGratia, captained by Mr. Morehouse from the beginning of our story. He was set to follow the same path as Mary Celeste, bound for Genoa a week later, which may explain why the ship would eventually be the one to discover the Mary Celeste, seeing as how she was 8 days and 1,200 miles behind the Mary Celeste. And notably, it was the experience of the DeGratia, and therefore we can assume for Mary Celeste that the entire voyage for the next week was hard rain and rough weather, which meant they battened down the hatches and kept them securely shut the whole way. 20 days after setting sail on November 25th, the date of the final entry of the first mate's log, the Mary Celeste approaches the Azore Islands, and that is the last sign of humans on that ship. And of course, Captain Morehouse would come across it 9 days later. And when folks were able to scrutinize both ships' courses and how they crossed paths, it was realized that the Mary Celeste must have sailed adrift in the direction she was heading originally. And at some point, the wind had turned her around and sent her back the way she came, which is how she ended up heading nose to nose with Morehouse's ship, even though he was coming behind her the whole way. Morehouse's men pump all 3 feet of that water out. They replace the sails with fresh sails they find on board the Mary Celeste, and then they follow Morehouse on the DeGratia to Gibraltar for that sweet, sweet salvage money. The ship was then seized due to suspicions of foul play, and a lengthy trial process dragged on to determine ownership and culpability. And this was big news, because again, nobody could comprehend why anyone would abandon a completely near perfect condition, seaworthy ship without any sign of struggle or impending peril. Everyone found this incredibly scary. Ships don't just lose entire crews unless the ship is lost too. This is the MH370 of their time, but it landed with nobody freaking on it, you know? Everybody in this era rides on boats, so this tapped into all their worst fears. It hit the zeitgeist so hard that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, eventual creator and author of Sherlock Holmes, he wrote a book about it. Not to mention the endless newspapers, magazines, blogs, and YouTubers just describing the same old story over and over and over. I feel seen. So an investigation was launched suspecting foul play, and many theories were explored. Was it murder / insurance fraud? Maybe the owner of the ship and partner with Briggs hired the crew to murder him and his family for the insurance money. Maybe the captain and his wife decided to just disappear and run off. Although it was established quite clearly that the captain was regretting leaving his son Arthur behind, and he was even talking about sending for him when they landed, so that seems unlikely. Were the growls and the grumbles they heard from the cargo hold some ghastly beast or apparition that took them all away? But what most likely happened? Well, first, let's consider the ship's cargo. Alcohol. They spent the majority of their voyage from New York to the coordinates of their last log entry in the Azores, going through rainstorms and rocky seas. This was jostling the alcohol around in the barrels, and at the same time, the storm was bringing atmospheric pressure changes from the cold, frigid air to the warmer air as they crossed the Atlantic. The jostling and warming up of those barrels would have led to an excessive buildup of fumes, and since it's stored in barrels, this was going to come out one of two ways. It was going to build up until it exploded, or it would seep out of cracks in the wood and slowly fill the cargo hold. This was pretty common knowledge when sailing with alcohol. Therefore, it was kind of standard operating procedure during calm weather to open up the hatches and air things out and let it vent. Of course, due to the constant bad weather, they were not only forced to keep these cargo hatches closed, they had literally battened down the hatches, meaning even normal windows were boarded shut so that they could keep dry from the weather. And on the morning of their final day in the logs, 8 a.m., November 25th, the crew woke up to nice weather for the first time in over a week. And so it's possible that they took that opportunity to finally open the hatches and vent the cargo hold of its fumes. They started with the skylight and then the 2 hatches on the deck. But after weeks of it building up, this would account for the groaning, moaning, and growling sounds heard from the cargo hold. You see, it's understood now that the gas building up inside the ship would eventually make it swell ever so slowly. And when that gas is vented, eventually, the wood, retracting back to its original shape, would moan and groan. Not to mention the gas, as it's vented out, depending on how the wind was blowing, could have made these people dizzy and confused. They knew it was a legitimate risk for this ship's cargo to explode under this condition, so hearing the groans, they perhaps took it as a warning of exactly that. This cargo hold might explode. So maybe Briggs, his wife, daughter, 7 crew members, and that cat, they all load up into the lifeboat with the intention to, say, run a rope from the ship to themselves and give themselves some safe distance until the gas either dissipates or the ship blows up. Either way, they're safe. This would also explain how the captain quarters beds were unmade when found. Things were not panicked and they left calmly, but just mission-oriented enough to let them leave a chore like that for another time. This idea is also supported by not only the obvious absence of the lifeboat, but the railing being removed from the side of the ship, because the lifeboat was actually stored on the deck, and therefore would have needed them to remove that railing to safely deploy it. Weather reports at the time say that after the break in weather on their final morning, the weather did quickly return to pretty awful, and so it's possible that the remaining sails that they did not take down in their half-assed exit could have picked up speed, made the boat start to move faster than they thought, and maybe their rope snapped, making it impossible to return to the ship. So yeah, this theory kills a lot of birds with one stone. It explains the moaning and the groaning in the cargo hold. It explains a possible reason for them to at least think they had to abandon a perfectly good seaworthy ship for the fear that it would explode. I mean, the first mate mentions the groaning in his own logbooks, although he never writes, "This gas is getting out of hand. Gonna bail. Wish us luck," like you'd think a guy in his position would've. But hey, they had a lot on their mind and maybe expected to come back anyway, so maybe. Here's another thought. Let's look at their last recorded coordinates. They're right there by this little island, Santa Maria. So why couldn't they have headed there in their little life raft when things went sideways? It's only a few miles. Well, again, according to weather reports at the time, it was bum luck that the wind was blowing away from that island, and the Mary Celeste and their little boat would have been pushed further and further away from it. And the last thing that supports this theory is that there are stories about a small boat with decomposed bodies eventually washing up on a Spanish shore, but no one was ever able to determine who these people were. Now, before we go all in with this theory of fumes and stepping away to air it out and getting disconnected, I have one more fact to give you. This ship is the Christine of ships, which is a car in a Stephen King book that killed a bunch of people. Because it didn't just wipe these 10 people off the face of the earth, or even its first captain. She ain't done. In September 1873, the Mary Celeste is finally put back into service, and she immediately kills another captain. So finally, the owner decided he was done with this ship, and he decided to hire 3 guys to sail her into some rocks and purposefully sink her for the insurance money. And right after doing so, all 3 of those guys died within 6 months. Yeah. So whether you're a believer in the supernatural or a skeptic, you gotta admit that is one seriously haunted ship. Thanks for watching. Stay weird.